There is a beauty and a quiet strength in a heart that humbles itself before the presence of God. The atmosphere shifts when we come without pretense or self-reliance, acknowledging our deep need for the one who gives life. The Spirit does not respond to the proud or to those who believe they are self-made or self-sufficient. Rather, it is humility, a deep, honest recognition of our dependence that draws the Spirit near. It has long been said that divine favor comes to those who refuse to rely on their own wisdom or capability. This is not just a comforting phrase, but a foundational truth. When we elevate ourselves and depend on only what we can accomplish, we close ourselves off from the greater work of the Spirit. We find that our abilities are limited, our wisdom incomplete, and our strength faint compared to what God offers. Yet something profound happens when we lay aside our self-assurance, fall to our knees, and quietly confess our need. Lord, I cannot do this without you. In those moments of surrender, there is an invisible movement, a shift in the heavenly realms. Grace rushes in to lift us, to fill what is lacking, and to make possible what we never could accomplish alone. Staying low in spirit, in humility, is not a sign of weakness, but rather the door to true strength. This posture allows the Spirit to work deeply and freely, transforming us and calling us higher, not by our own striving, but by God's generous hand. As we choose humility, admitting our need and laying down our own pride, something changes not only within us, but all around us. The burdens that once felt impossible begin to lighten, but not because the challenges have vanished. It is the presence of the Spirit drawn by our surrender that strengthens arms grown weary and brings peace to anxious hearts. In this quiet posture, hope revives. No longer striving in our own strength, we sense a lift as grace does its gentle work. The deepest wounds begin to heal, and confusion gives way to clarity. We discover that the greatest breakthroughs often happen not in our striving, but in our yielding. Often, wisdom comes in stillness and provision follows trust. Each day invites us to embrace this way of living, to acknowledge our limits and to invite divine help. There lies true freedom, knowing we are not alone and we are not meant to carry life's weight on our own. In this place of humility, the Spirit is not far off, but near and attentive, ready to do what we cannot do ourselves. As we remain in this humble posture, we begin to recognize that everything good flows from beyond ourselves. We move forward not in self-confidence, but in sacred dependence, and we witness how the ordinary becomes extraordinary when surrendered into divine hands. When we remain open and humble before God, our lives become fertile ground for the Spirit's activity. This is not about dramatic gestures or public declarations, but about the quiet daily decision to trust, to let go of control, and allow God to shape us from within. In these moments, we may find ourselves speaking words we do not understand, praying in ways that transcend our own thoughts, as if the Spirit is praying through us. This gift of tongues is just one example of how the Spirit moves in those who yield, who are willing to be surprised and changed by God's presence. The journey of humility is ongoing. It is not a destination, but a posture we return to again and again. Each act of surrender, each whispered prayer for help, each moment of honest need invites the Spirit to work in ways we could never predict or orchestrate. The more we practice this posture, the more we notice how the Spirit's guidance becomes clear, how peace settles over our restless hearts, and how our desires begin to align with a greater purpose. Ultimately, this is not about our own effort, but about our willingness to receive. The Spirit's power is not summoned by our striving, but by our openness. As we continue to bow low, we discover that the greatest miracles are not always the visible ones, but the quiet transformations within the healing of our hearts, the renewal of our minds, and the deepening of our love for God and others. In this humble place, we are never alone, and we are always being led towards something greater than ourselves. As we persist in this humble posture, our lives begin to reflect a subtle yet unmistakable transformation. The Spirit's influence is not always dramatic or immediate, but it is persistent, gently shaping our character, refining our motives, and expanding our capacity for compassion. In this space of surrender, even our spiritual experiences, such as receiving the gift of tongues, become less about personal achievement and more about a deepening intimacy with God. These encounters are not trophies to be displayed, but sacred moments that remind us of our dependence in God's nearness. Over time, humility becomes less about a single act and more about a way of being. We start to see our limitations not as failures, but as invitations for God to move. Our prayers grow simpler, our listening more attentive, and our hearts more receptive to the Spirit's quiet promptings. We learn that true spiritual strength is found not in what we can do, but in what we are willing to receive. Even in moments of uncertainty or weakness, this posture of humility keeps the door open for the Spirit's work. It is here in our honest need that we find ourselves carried beyond our own capacity, guided, comforted, and empowered in ways we could never accomplish alone. The journey is not always easy, but it is marked by a quiet assurance that we are held, known, and loved by the one who meets us in our humility and leads us into greater fullness of life. As we continue to walk this path of humility, we begin to see our lives as part of a larger story, one where our smallness is not a limitation, but a gateway for God's greatness to shine through. The Spirit's work in us is not always visible to others, nor is it always felt in dramatic ways, but it is real and ongoing. Each day becomes an opportunity to lay down our own agendas and to ask, "What would you have me do?" Not as a form of resignation, but as an act of trust in a wisdom greater than our own. This posture changes how we relate to others, too. When we recognize our own need for grace, we become more patient and understanding toward those around us. Our hearts soften, our judgments ease, and we begin to see people through the eyes of compassion rather than criticism. The Spirit's presence in us begins to overflow into our relationships, bringing healing, reconciliation, and hope where there was once division or hurt. Over time, the fruit of this humility becomes evident not just in isolated moments of spiritual experience, but in the steady, quiet transformation of our character. We find ourselves more at peace, less driven by fear or the need to prove ourselves, and more anchored in the assurance that we are loved and led. The gift of tongues, or any other spiritual gift, is no longer sought for its own sake, but as a natural expression of a life surrendered to God's leading. In the end, the journey of humility is not about achieving a certain spiritual state, but about learning to live in constant awareness of our need for God. It is here, in the place of honest dependence, that we discover the deepest joys, the truest peace, and the most authentic expressions of the Spirit's power in our lives. This is the beauty of a heart that stays low, not to diminish itself, but to make room for God to do what only God can do. As we embrace this way of living marked by humility and a quiet openness to God's presence, we find ourselves drawn into a rhythm of grace that shapes every aspect of our lives. The moments when we feel most vulnerable, most aware of our own limitations, often become the very moments when the Spirit's movement is most evident. It is not about striving for perfection or spiritual accomplishment, but about learning to rest in the assurance that we are held by one who knows us fully and loves us completely. In this posture, our spiritual experiences, such as speaking in tongues, are not ends in themselves, but signs of a deeper reality. The reality of God's nearness and active active involvement in our lives. These gifts are not badges of honor, but reminders that we are part of something much larger than ourselves. They point us back to the source of all grace, encouraging us to stay low, to listen, and to receive. Over time, this humility begins to shape our prayers, our decisions, and our relationships. We become less concerned with appearances or outcomes, and more attentive to the gentle leading of the Spirit. Even in the midst of uncertainty or difficulty, we learn to trust that God is at work, often in ways we cannot see or understand. Our faith deepens not because we have all the answers, but because we have learned to lean into the mystery of God's love and guidance. Ultimately, the journey of humility is a journey of freedom from the need to control, to impress, or to prove ourselves. It is an invitation to live with open hands and a willing heart, ready to receive whatever God has for us, whether it comes in the form of spiritual gifts, quiet assurance, or unexpected grace. In this place, we discover that the truest miracles are not the ones that draw attention, but the ones that transform us from within, shaping us into people who reflect the love and humility of Christ in our everyday lives. As we remain in this posture of humility, our spiritual journey becomes less about our own efforts and more about the gentle, persistent work of the Spirit within us. Each day invites us to lay down our need for control and to receive what God offers, not as a reward for our striving, but as a gift to those who trust. This trust is not passive, it is an active surrender, a willingness to let go of our plans and to embrace the unknown with open hands and a quiet heart. In this space, the spiritual experiences we encounter, such as the gift of tongues, are not the goal, but natural expressions of a life yielded to God's presence. These moments remind us that we are part of a story much larger than our own, and that our deepest fulfillment comes not from what we achieve, but from how we allow ourselves to be shaped by grace. The Spirit's gifts are given not to elevate us, but to draw us closer to the heart of God and to equip us for love and service in the world. Over time, this humility begins to color every aspect of our lives. Our prayers become simpler, our listening more attentive, and our relationships more marked by compassion and understanding. We find ourselves less driven by fear or the need for recognition, and more anchored in the quiet assurance that we are seen, known, and loved. Even in times of uncertainty or difficulty, we learn to rest in the promise that God is at work, often in ways we cannot see or predict. Ultimately, this journey is about learning to live with open hearts, ready to receive, ready to be changed, and ready to reflect the love and humility of Christ in our everyday lives. It is here, in the place of honest dependence, that we discover the truest peace, the deepest joy, and the most authentic expressions of the Spirit's power. This is the beauty and the mystery of a life lived low before God, not diminished, but enlarged by grace. Living in humility before God does not mean shrinking back from life's challenges or opportunities, but rather, it means facing them with a different kind of strength, one rooted in trust rather than self-reliance. As we continue to surrender our plans and our pride, we begin to notice how the Spirit's guidance becomes more discernible, not through loud signs or dramatic events, but through gentle promptings, quiet convictions, and unexpected moments of clarity. These are the ways the Spirit often speaks to those who are willing to listen, who have learned that true wisdom is found in stillness and surrender. Over time, this way of living begins to shape our desires. We find ourselves longing not for personal acclaim or visible success, but for deeper communion with God and greater love for others. The gifts of the Spirit, including the gift of tongues, are no longer sought as proof of spiritual maturity, but as expressions of a heart attuned to God's presence. They become part of a larger tapestry, a life marked by gratitude, openness, and a willingness to be used in ways we might never have imagined. Even in seasons of waiting or uncertainty, humility keeps our hearts soft and receptive. We learn to trust that God's timing and purposes are perfect, even when they do not align with our own expectations. In this posture, we are free to celebrate the small, ordinary moments as much as the extraordinary ones, knowing that each is an opportunity for the Spirit to work. Ultimately, this journey is not about arriving at a destination, but about growing in trust and love day by day. It is about learning to live with open hands, ready to give, ready to receive, and ready to be surprised by the ways God chooses to move in and through us. In this place of humble dependence, we discover that the greatest adventure is not in achieving, but in being transformed by the one who meets us in our weakness and leads us into fullness of life. As we continue to walk in humility, we begin to recognize that every moment, whether ordinary or extraordinary, holds the potential for the Spirit to move. It is not only in the grand gestures or dramatic encounters that God's presence is felt, but often in the quiet, unnoticed spaces of daily life. A heart that remains open and low before God learns to discern the subtle ways the Spirit works, a sudden sense of peace in the midst of chaos, a quiet conviction to extend kindness, or an unexpected word of encouragement that comes at just the right time. This ongoing surrender shapes our perspective. We start to see our own stories as part of a much larger narrative, one where our weaknesses and limitations are not obstacles, but openings for grace. The gift of tongues, or any spiritual gift, is no longer something we grasp for, but something we receive with gratitude as a sign of God's nearness and care. These experiences remind us that we are never alone and that the Spirit is always at work, even when we cannot see or understand the full picture. In this posture, our faith becomes less about what we can accomplish and more about what we are willing to receive. We learn to trust that God's plans are good, even when they differ from our own. We become people who are marked not by self-sufficiency, but by a quiet confidence in the one who holds all things together. And as we continue to yield, we find that the greatest transformations happen not in spite of our humility, but because of it, ushering us into a life that is richer, deeper, and more connected to the heart of God than we ever imagined possible. As we live in this state of humble openness, we begin to notice how the Spirit's presence weaves through the ordinary fabric of our days. The gift of tongues, or any other spiritual experience, is not an isolated event, but a thread in a larger tapestry, evidence of a life increasingly surrendered to God's leading. These moments, whether quiet or profound, serve as reminders that we are part of a story much greater than ourselves, and that our role is not to orchestrate, but to respond. Over time, this posture of humility shifts our focus from seeking spiritual experiences for their own sake to seeking the giver behind every gift. We learn to value not only the dramatic encounters, but also the steady, unseen work of the Spirit in shaping our character, renewing our minds, and deepening our love for others. The more we yield, the more we find ourselves attuned to the gentle rhythms of grace, promptings to pray, to serve, to forgive, to hope, even when circumstances seem bleak. In this journey, our faith becomes less about what we can achieve and more about how we can receive. We discover that the greatest spiritual growth often happens in the quiet, in the waiting, in the small acts of trust that go unnoticed by the world. And as we continue to bow low, we are drawn ever deeper into the heart of God, where true peace, true joy, and true transformation are found. Here, in the place of humble dependence, we learn that the most powerful spiritual life is not marked by spectacle, but by a quiet, enduring trust in the one who holds all things together. Like, comment, and subscribe.